Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Africa's a Country Talk. If you don't know who I am, I'm Shoki, streaming live from Johannesburg, South Africa, joined as always by my lovely co-host Sean Jacobs, who's in Brooklyn, New York. And what you're watching is Africa's a Country's weekly talk and interview show, which broadcasts every single Tuesday at 7 p.m. African time, 6 p.m. if you are in London, I think, or 5 p.m. I'm not really sure about other time zones. But our show is always produced by Anthony Engel, who's in Cape Town, South Africa, and this is episode 37.
So that was Will with the Kevin Durant intro. It's like, do you know who I am? As he dunks on you, like he's like, and you know who I am, Will Shoki. So anyway, I'm Sean Jacobs. I have a story for another day when somebody introduced themselves to me, somebody famous, and he sort of said, you know, I'm X. And I said, yeah, and I'm Sean Jacobs.
Was it actually Kevin Durant who was the person introducing himself?
What is this?
Was it Kevin Durant who was the famous person?
No, it wasn't Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant, I actually saw Kevin Durant one day. I've seen Kevin Durant play basketball, like, in person for the Nets. And also when he used to play for actually I haven't seen him for the Nets. I've seen him play for the Golden State Warriors, destroying the then really bad Brooklyn Nets. But I was just going to say, he came one time, and Ben Fogel was with me. He can confirm this. And Kevin Durant came to Brooklyn to support some local basketball league, and he said nothing. He just sat in a corner. I mean, he's like the star of the show. But he just sits there like people are waiting for him to make some speech. I don't know, up from whatever, up from the AAU, which is the amateur association kind of basketball, youth basketball. They probably were waiting for him to tell kids, like, how do you become Kevin Durant? And he just like sat there, back in the bus and he left. And he had a lot more to say to Michael Rappaport. But anyway, let's get to more like serious matters. So it just happens that tomorrow, May 5th, is Karl Marx's birthday. Some people often confuse me for Karl Marx because I have a long, although I'm not as smart as Karl Marx. So we thought it would be fitting today to ask whether Karl Marx's ideas are still relevant, especially to Africans and the African diaspora. Our guests later on the program are Annie Olaloku, I gotta get that right, Olaloku-Teriba, and Zeyad el Nabolsy. Annie is an independent researcher based in London, working on the legacies of empire and the complex histories of race. And Zeyad is a PhD student in Africana Studies at Cornell University, working on African philosophy of culture. And this is a good one, African Marxism, so he'll have something to say for real, and the philosophy of science and modern African intellectual history. But that's for later, in the program.
And a reminder, as always, if you missed our program last week, it was a great one. I mean, I don't want to brag, but most of them turned out to be pretty great. And we celebrated the independence of Sierra Leone and South Africa, which was on April 27th. Sierra Leone celebrated Independence Day, South Africa Freedom Day. And on the show, we assessed the road traveled since independence. Sierra Leone wanted to 1960, South Africa 1994. And we were joined by the filmmaker Seun Babalola and the writer Ishmael Bia, as well as Sisonke Msimang. So clips for that episode are available on our YouTube channel. But as usual, check out the whole thing on our Patreon, along with all of the episodes from our archive.
And I can definitely say both are all the guests were excellent. But I want to give a shout out to when Sisonke talked about the fire and archives, which I think is a really nice little bit that I can recommend that people rewatch. I mean, the whole program was incredible. Ismail talking about the question of language in Sierra Leone, Seun talking about what Africa, what does freedom mean to women's liberation. We've done a similar program before, always gets postponed, and I think that's another theme that ran through that program. So remember to hit the like button below. and subscribe on our YouTube channel, as well as follow us on Facebook. I'm sort of saying the same thing Will has said, but we have to say it over and over again to get people to do it. We're also on Instagram and on Twitter. And I would just say go check out all our work in general. But before we invite our guests, let's talk about just the kind of stuff that we've been looking at in the last week or so. Just things that we, because hey, we do read. And I know people think I only watch football, but I do read. I care about a lot of other stuff. In fact, earlier today, Will and I was having a WhatsApp back and forth about Mbembe's on the post-colony. I actually enjoyed that. So anyway, the thing I wanted to sort of shout out or just kind of mention to start the program is book criticism. I actually feel that I always enjoy book criticism because there's no way that I can read all the new books that are coming out. And often, if reviews are good, then it's always great to follow it. And we have our own book review section, although we're trying to figure out how to do it differently. We just appointed a book review editor, Anakwa Romena. I hope he's listening. So watch out for how we're going to cover books differently, the book industry. We're hoping to have him come on the program actually regularly in the future, but watch out for that. But I want to quickly shout out the two books that there's a book, the reviews that I've liked recently. One is both on this new book about Edward Said. So there's a new book, it's a biography written by Timothy Brennan, who's a former student of Said's. It's called Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said. And I ordered a copy of this book because the reviews have kind of inspired me to buy copies. But just think quickly, it's about Said, who's in a way was just an incredible, the versatile person. I mean, in summary, a literary theorist, pianist, a music critic, and I think Pankaj Mishra, which is one of these reviewers, sort of refers to him as New York's most famous public intellectual. Susan Sontag. I think he's probably equal to them in being from New York. And then he describes him also as America's most prominent advocate for Palestinian rights. So there are two reviews that I want to single out and I can recommend. Actually, there was a review that appeared in the Wall Street Journal that was really, the less I say about it, the better. It was just another attempt to kind of go after Said's legacy and besmirch him. And I don't think it succeeded, but it's the kind of thing that's very common when people write about Edward Said, misrepresenting his work for Palestinian liberation. There's sort of, trite attacks of him as being an anti-Semite, which is, of course, none of that is true. But the two reviews, as I said, that I really like one is called The Reorientations of Edward Said, and it appeared in the New Yorker, I think April 26th. If you might be able to read it online, by Pankaj Mishra, the Indian critic. And the second one is by Adam Schatz in the London Review of Books. And Adam Schatz's one, I think, is called Palestinianisms. So just quickly on both, Twitter is not always a representative sample, but if you read Twitter, like one of the really good ones that I saw was Chris Lee summarized, and I totally agree with him about Pankaj's review, saying that it's far and away the best review of Tim Brennan's bio of Edward Said. And he himself, he refers to this point of being perplexed by those who have been assigned to review the book and by extension Said's life for the New York Times, but that Pankaj Mishra gets it. And there's a couple of really nice, parts in Pankaj Mishra's review. The reference to the fact that Edward, for example, he only really became politically concerned with the Palestinian. We've always been there, the fact that he was Palestinian, but he had a weird schizophrenic relationship with that part of his identity. But it was after the 6-Day War that he became way more connected to the Palestinian struggle. And there's this line in there, for example, in the review about how he barely engaged with the work of Ralph Ellison or James Baldwin, people that he later would admire when he first got to Columbia in the early 60s. And in fact, he had very little contact with the civil rights movement. And when students protesting the war in Vietnam disrupted a class of his, he actually called campus security. And then I think the other part that I really like from the Pankaj Mishra review is how he writes about Edward Said's writing Orientalism, and some of the criticism of Orientalism that came out of the region, particularly by Ahmad, and how Edward Said himself wasn't necessarily, Orientalism was a big book, but he didn't think that was the only argument he wanted to make. But in the process, people began to see him only as this writer who writes about, who wrote about, the Orientalist image, if you want, in the West. And then there's other little beautiful things in there and I don't want to give away the whole review, but I can recommend that one. And then just quickly, Adam Satz's review in the New Yorker, in the London Review of Books, some great. There was one tweet I was going to read, but I can't find it now. But Adams is, I think, 4 times as long as Pankaj's, and it includes some little gems like the fact that Edward Said's daughter recommended Sinead O'Connor's music to him, and he became a fan. I know that might surprise some people. And then there's one other sweet one in there, which is something I've always wanted to write about, which is Edward Said's relationship with popular culture, which is that in fact the only thing that Edward Said liked outside of playing classical music was that he liked playing and watching tennis. But that's for another day. In any case, well, what were you been reading?
Well, I haven't really been reading much because, like you, I actually don't enjoy reading. I have to do a lot of it, but it's a lot of work. I think we can just admit that, especially nowadays, it's always exhausting. Especially, I don't like reading Marx. I'm gonna take that up later. But jokes aside, I just want to touch on something you raised just now, which is about how one of the issues closest to Said's heart, and one of the things his advocacy was most pronounced in, was his support for the cause of Palestinian liberation. And it is bizarre that he's often portrayed as being this anti-Semite, this narrow nationalist, when the truth is that Said was one of the earliest proponents of a universalist outcome in the struggle. He wrote that path-breaking essay in 1999 for the New York Times, advocating for the one-state solution and advocating for an outcome that would reimagine the territories of Israel and Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea as being a place that could belong to both Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And it's interesting that at the same time, there's all of this renewed interest in Said's life, thanks to Timothy Brennan's new biography. We're also sort of reaching a kind of impasse in the situation, insofar as, there's been this groundbreaking report released by Human Rights Watch, one of the leading human rights organizations in the world, which declares that Israel is in fact an apartheid state, something we in South Africa have known for a long time, given our own lived experience. And this also follows on from Israel's leading human rights organization as well, B'Tselem, also declaring earlier this year that Israel is an apartheid state. And as I said earlier, South Africans who've lived under a history of racialized segregation, of political oppression, and of near ethnic cleansing know this very well. So I suppose the question remains of what is going to be the outcome of all of this? What is going to be the outcome of all of these declarations that human rights tragedy continues to be ongoing in Israel and Palestine? The recent reports are that there's families in East Jerusalem that are on the cusp of being evicted for their homes to make way for a kind of Zionist tourist attraction. So I suppose it's one of those moments when you start to miss a figure like Said, because he had this moral clarity on the issue, this political vision, which I think imagined questioning the nation state form of Israel, which is the basis of its political project. And ever since the passage of the nation state law, which spoke about how sovereignty is unique to Jews, it's definitely an opportunity for that nation state form of social organization to be challenged. But I guess the moment does feel a little bit immobile because the political forces aren't around that are capable of championing such a vision. I mean, the Palestinian elections, which were set to happen this week, have been indefinitely postponed because Abbas's Palestinian Liberation Organization have delayed them yet again. I mean, there's disagreements with the Israeli government over certain terms, but you do get the sense that Palestine, the ruling class in Palestine, comprising Fatah and Hamas, have just reached a point where they're obsolete, where they're completely unable to provide a vision to Palestinians that can actually mobilize a mass movement of the kind that we saw here in South Africa. So yeah, just missing someone like Zeyad, who was able to speak with such clarity on the issue.
And I also thought one of the things that I liked that those reviews captured was his ability to, so he had a thing about never feeling at home, and always feeling as an outsider, I think, even in his own intellectual work. But I think the thing that, just to connect to what you're saying now, is his ability to adapt politically, to not sort of remain rigid, but to understand that, the balance of forces politically, and realizing, okay, that tactic doesn't work right now. Like when it was a when it was an armed struggle, when it was a diplomatic struggle, like when it was time to seek reapproachment, but on a sort of equal terms. Like Zeyad seemed to be very attuned to that throughout his life, and I think that's another one of those things. When you say like there's something often we miss politically now, then you think back on those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of figures and ideas that we miss politically now, to talk about one which does seem to be in decline.
Don't have to sound so somber, Will.
Sorry, what was that?
No, I said we don't have to. He was like, speaking of figures, I was like, yo, we don't have to sound so somber about Karl Marx. We've declared him dead and gone.
Well, it's just somber in the sense that you're reflecting on a political moment where that just feels sort of stuck. And maybe it's because the kind of ideas that Marx presented and that Zeyad presented are now marginal. But to talk to people who know better than we do about whether or not that is the case, we're going to talk about whether or not the third world still needs Marx. And our first guest, we're really excited to have him on the show, is Zeyad el Nabolsy, and Olaloku-Teriba is also going to join in a moment. So we'll introduce her when she's on the show. But to introduce Zeyad is a PhD student in Africana Studies at Cornell University, working on the African philosophy of culture, African Marxism, as well as the philosophy of science and a modern African intellectual history. So Zeyad, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful that you were able to come on. So to maybe start with a very personal question, when I think about the first time I encountered Karl Marx, as it was with a lot of people, it would have been in high school. And, my parents are Tanzanian, so I heard a lot about Julius Nyerere, but he was always this sort of mythical figure. I understood that he was a socialist, didn't really understand what that meant. And so at I think 14 years old, had a library card for my closest library, took out a copy of Manifesto, and that was, my first introduction to Marx. So I wanted to know how did you first encounter Karl Marx?
Right. So I just want to say thank you so much for having me on the show. This is a good question. I mean, okay, so 14 for you, okay, you beat me, definitely way older than 14 for me. I'd say maybe 17 or something, 17, 18. So I had an interest in reading history. And, eventually, obviously, even if you're reading sort of anti-Marxist history, they always hint at this, they call it like the reductive economistic Marxist view and move on or something, right? So I got curious, okay, I want to see what is this reductive economistic view of history. Because I guess I have this contrarian strain. So I said, okay, so the first thing I read, I think, was the Communist Manifesto, which is, I think what most people read. And it was sort of illuminating to sort of have this understanding, okay, we can have these structural explanations. Because I was reading a lot of stuff that had a kind of personalist approach to history or something, right? Great people doing things, failing and doing things, and so on. So that was sort of my introduction, was through history, I guess, interest in that sort of stuff.
I was going to say my first encounter with Marx is the manifesto, of course, because the 1980s in South Africa, when I was in high school, is it's highly politicized. There's like a mass struggle going on, or some people might characterize it as a revolution. And people are just passing around this manifesto, and you can read it. It's very simple, right? It's actually like a tract, like a pamphlet. But I would say I really started reading it in university, at the University of Cape Town, and I would credit probably somebody like Mary Simons, who was the daughter of Jack Simons, and Ray Alexander, who was a trade unionist. Jack Simons he wrote a book called Class and Color, which is a classic from the sort of first half of the 20th century. And he was in exile at that time, and his daughter taught at the university. I think right before that, she may have been detained. But anyway, and I really enjoyed, having classes with her, political theory classes, comparative politics classes, and that's where I started reading Marx. And I would say historical materialism, even if I'm sort of wavering now and then, it remains sort of my way of trying to make sense of the world. Your point about personalized structures versus these, this kind of understanding the world, superstructure, base, and so on. Like, you could start from that. You can, history moving, and so on. In any case, how would you say, as a follow-up question, how have your ideas to Karl Marx's ideas changed or evolved, like over time?
Right. So I guess I would say, and I think that happens to a lot of people, I developed a kind of interest in sort of what we can say the philosophical aspects of Karl Marx. And actually, I was sort of doing my undergraduate in engineering and finished that, but I developed an interest in philosophy. So I ended up doing a master's in philosophy, and I ended up doing it on Hegel, because, obviously, you need to have some sort of understanding of Hegel to grasp Marx. And people obviously debate the extent to which this is, stringent requirement. I don't think you should force people to read Hegel before, before they read Marx. But I would say that over time, I've sort of, I've come to sort of see the limits of a certain philosophical approach to Marx that overemphasizes maybe the normative aspects in his thinking, which and those, there is obviously lots of debates about the extent to which Marx developed a normative theory of any sorts about justice or equality or something like that. And I think over time I've sort of developed an interest in the kind of more, if you can say, the critique of political economy as a project. And I had to sort of try, okay, I'm going to try to teach myself some classical political economy so I can understand its critique. So that's sort of where I'm at now. And also as a function of time, I've sort of moved away a bit maybe from attempts to answer the charge of racism and Eurocentrism directly through Marxology, because you see that a lot, right? People go, they excavate Marx's, we can say minor writings to see, okay, well, actually he said this about this place, and we can track, a development in his understanding of Indian society in the 19th century. And now I'm more interested in sort of the global reception of Marxism, a kind of global intellectual history. So that's sort of where I'm at right now.
I'm also reading Hegel at the moment.
That's good.
It's too tough. It's a lot. I mean, I'm interested in what you just said now about you making this transition away from sort of getting bogged down in these allegations that Marx was a racist, and that case being built out of isolating the fragments in his work. What is the nature of that allegation? What do people sort of point to in alleging that Marx was a racist, or in some instances an anti-Semite? And how would you you say you think that's kind of peripheral to the main thrust of his project, which is a critique of political economy, but how does it figure in to all of that?
Right. So if you take, for example, debates about the Asiatic mode of production, because that's one way, that debate has sort of raged on for a very long time. And so obviously this concept has a lot of European intellectual history of the 18th and 19th century behind it, and Marx is drawing on that for sure. There is no doubt. But essentially, for example, people might point to his description of India in his article of, I'm trying to remember, 1853, I think, where he talks about, a kind of stagnant society where nothing really happens, at least at the level of structural social transformation. So you have like political revolutions, this dynasty going in and, conquering the subcontinent, and another one coming along. But, he presents us with this image that, maybe at the level of what he describes as sort of like the village communes, nothing is happening. All what's happening is the people in power are changing, but the structure is the same. And people have said, well, this is sort of Eurocentric and racist, and it's understandable why people would think that because, again, obviously you guys already talked about Edward Said. So one prominent element in Orientalist discourse was the claim that in the East or in the Orient, nothing ever really happens, changes, at a fundamental level. So it's understandable why people would try to assimilate that to a kind of Orientalist discourse. But I think in response to that, you have people like Kevin Anderson, for example, who wrote this book, Marx at the Margins. I think came out like 2010 or so, I can't remember. But he tries to see, he looks at how Marx actually, Marx's views develop on India after the 1850s and so on, where he develops a kind of more nuanced understanding. And I guess I would say I think this approach is very useful, but I think there are limits to this approach, because for me it would be much more interesting to see, to look at the reception of Marx in India by Indian intellectuals, for example, in the 20th century, and what sense of that, because there is a way to make discourse about Eurocentrism itself Eurocentric, right, where you just keep talking, we'll keep doing these excavations.
Yeah, I mean, Annie's just joined us. I've got a question about what you've just said now, but I'd like to bring on Annie to the show. Welcome, Annie. We're so happy to have you on today. And if you don't know yet, Annie is an independent researcher based in London, working on the legacies of empire and the complex histories of race. And we're talking about Marx and race at the moment. But before we continue with that conversation, Annie, we want to start with something a little bit personal. We were just reflecting on how all of us first encountered Marx in our lives. So we want to ask you too, when did you first encounter Marx? How did you come to know of this gray bearded guy always sitting very serious? For portraits.
Oh my God, that's such a funny question to ask me, because in fact, this person is now my best friend, and I met him about, will be going on 11 years now. And the first day I ever met him, he was my guide at his school. I was doing a competition, and he was telling me, you should read this like workers' paper. Have you heard of Karl Marx? And it's so funny because I didn't tell him. He was the first person who'd ever said Karl Marx's name to me until we had been friends for about 10 years. But yeah, that was a really transformative period in my life. I kind of grew up in a working class neighborhood, had these instinctive feelings about the world and something being wrong with the world. Had, like, I guess, what were some of the worst experiences of the excesses of capitalism that you could have in the imperial core. And then all of a sudden I had a language to describe that in. I had a reason to understand some of the experiences I'd gone through. And I had a methodology for thinking about how I might resist in a way that's effective. And when I got to university, my reading of Marx obviously paired with my reading of Fanon. And it became even more liberating. But happy to kind of answer more questions along that line. It's really funny because I don't know if anyone knows him. His name was Barnaby Rain. But yeah.
I know Barnaby, yeah, good comrade. And I mean, it's interesting what you've just said now that your reading with Marx in university overlapped with your reading of Fanon. We're talking about Marx and race just now, and Zeyad, before you joined, was talking about Marx's understanding of the Asiatic mode of production and how this was a methodology that he applied to understand, the development of capitalism, or the non-development of capitalism in Asia and the East. So I suppose the question is, when, Zeyad was saying that it would be more interesting to look at how Marx is received by contemporary intellectuals. Marx's critique of political economy, at some point, people say that it's insufficient insofar as it doesn't fully capture the sort of the superstructure of that society, let's just say, right? It's too narrow, it's too focused on the economy, and it ignores these other elements of society which are just as important to social life, such as culture and ideology and so on. And in both Africa and in India during the colonial period, that was a significant critique leveled against Marxism. So when it comes to understanding his reception there, I mean, what was the basis? I mean, I'm asking you guys to explain a lot, but what was the basis of that critique? And does it warrant a departure from Marxism, or is it compatible with Marxism? I mean, Fanon, for example, some people say he isn't a Marxist, some people say he is. How do we tell?
I'm happy to jump in. I think that there are two ways of conceiving. I mean, obviously there are loads of traditions of Marxism, but there are two ways broadly in the way that I conceive of it, of like understanding Marxism as a marker for a political project. One is to say that this guy called Marx came along and like wrote this magnum opus, which contains within it everything about our society and how, and everything about human history and how we might kind of resist the ethical and moral incursions of capitalism today. There's another way of conceiving of it, which I think is what really great Marxist tradition, which I'm going to trace from Lenin to National Liberation, Black Panthers, are doing. And they're saying, even Stokely Carmichael kind of falls under this tradition of Komiture. They're saying, here's this guy called Karl Marx. He cannot have invented the notion of wanting to free ourselves and live collectively. But what he offers us is a set of tools for thinking about the world and interrogating the conditions that we are faced with that are helpful, right? And so Fanon makes a comment, I believe it's in Concerning Violence, where he talks about in the colonial situation, Marx must be stretched, right? Crucially, he doesn't say Marx must be rejected. And I think that sometimes people are looking for Marx's work to do everything, anything and everything. And I think both Marxists do that and anti-Marxists. But it's more helpful to kind of think of him as having a very specific project looking at the development of capitalism in Europe, Western Europe, making some generalized comments about the broader kind of geographical frame, but speaking to a moment in the late 19th century. Marx could not have conceived of the developments in imperialism that happened in the early 20th century. Marx could not have conceived of the rise of neoliberalism. And so when we're asking him to speak to that, to offer us a blueprint for getting out of that, rather than a methodology for understanding that, we're asking too much of him. Sorry, I didn't, it does frustrate me a little bit.
Zeyad, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with Annie that, when we're talking, so to take sort of the question of this discussion, do Africans need Karl Marx? I think, very much to Annie's point, we're asking, is Karl Marx someone who has provided adequate analytic tools that we start from, right? We're not asking, should we only read Karl Marx or end with Karl Marx? And I think to that extent, we can definitely talk about the adequacy of the analytical tools that were provided. So to go back, for example, to this question of Orientalism, racism, and Eurocentrism, I think if we look at sort of what historical materialism is as a theory of social transformations, we would see that even, yes, of course, we can point out to elements that are Orientalist in Marx's writings and racist in Marx's writings. But what the historical materialist worldview does, I think, is undermine a lot of, especially the racist civilizational discourse at the conceptual level, which was prevalent in the 19th century, which continued to be prevalent into the 20th century, and until today, in fact.
So just for those who are just tuning in, we are discussing Karl Marx. In my brain, I'm also thinking this discussion about Karl Marx, if this was like 20 years ago, it would be very different, because a lot, maybe this is to Annie's point, a lot has happened globally. Different kinds of social movements have emerged that complicate, that has complicated this discussion on Karl Marx. So, and the reason we're doing it, it's his birthday tomorrow. He was born on the 5th of May, 1818. So one of the comments that so on the YouTube channel, there are people have been making lots of comments. And maybe the next question regards Karl Marx and trying to understand African politics, or the African political economy. And people are there making comments that, people like Walter Rodney, Claude Ake from Nigeria, Sula Marx from South Africa, Bill Freund, that many of these people, you can see them as part of a Marxist tradition coming out of Africa. My question is, why? Well, let me say, the question we had is like, why is Marx and Marxism in decline in Africa? I mean, that, well, first we'd have to, I suppose, agree that it's in decline. I mean, I have the sense that it's in decline. And then I think the follow-up is then, why is that the case?
Actually, so you go first.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's a difficult question. I think it would depend, regionally where we're looking, of course. But I take your general point. I mean, I think one interesting phenomenon since sort of maybe like the 1990s is to see sort of the role that what we can call sort of the transformation of African politics into a kind of NGO, dominated project. Because what has happened is that you've had all those experienced organizers who were either in Marxist organizations or Marxist influenced organizations, and they've sort of been co-opted, I think, in this NGO structure. I think, for example, in Egypt, that's definitely the case. Maybe in South Africa, it's similar. So I think even sort of the kind of organizational experience that would allow people to develop an organization that would intervene at a kind of opportune moments, because we've had opportune moments in different countries. I think that sort of hasn't been there. And I think there is also, and this is hinted at, I believe, in the write-up for this episode, the kind of transformation, again, of emancipatory politics into a kind of cultural discourse taking place in the realm of representation, which, not to say that this is not important, but I think there are very clear limits to that. But it's a good question, and I don't really, pretend to have a well-developed answer.
Jump in. If you have the answer.
I would make the slightly bold claim that I think that mass Marxist organization is on the decline globally, right? And I remember Robin Kelly pointed out, like reminded us, like when the Russian Revolution happened, there were like waves of strikes, which included 70% of the population. That is a critical mass, right? And so I think two things contribute to this. One is an erasure and assault on a revolutionary imaginary as it was able to institutionalize itself in the kind of mid to late 1970s, the decline in neoliberalization and marketization of African universities, the reorientation of curriculums, and like to get some of these texts that we're talking about in terms of like African political economists and Marxist, the African Marxist tradition, like you're looking at 60, 70 pounds for a copy because they're just out of print, right? And so in a very tangible sense, the texts which are able to speak to the specific context of African countries are becoming more and more out of reach. I think the second dynamic of that, and I think Zeyad's completely right about the rise of a culturalist frame of understanding politics. I think that in different ways in the imperial core and in the global periphery and loads of parts of the world, what we've seen is a recession of the political. And things are increasingly understood in cultural terms and essentialist terms. I am trying to interrogate in my work the relationship between that and the rise of the relationship between the rise of like that form of essentialist culturalist politics embedded in not just representational politics, but also embedded in some of the strands of identity politics, which seem to be taking root. I'm going to risk myself getting cancelled on the internet and talk about, the developments in the kind of fallist movements in South Africa, where you see like radical political imaginaries be increasingly inhibited by essentialist understandings of race, of culture, and of political struggle, essentially, right? And so I do think that maybe the question is more so, what is it about the conditions of this moment, which mean that the Marxist theory that we're drawing on doesn't have the degree of appeal that it historically has had? And what does that mean for how we reorient our tools of analysis and what we need to be speaking to?
So,
sorry, it's interesting you say that. I know Will has a question, but I read this earlier today in the introduction to On the Post-Colony by Achille Mbembe, who's also very much associated with this kind of, maybe we should debate him another time. But your comment about the move to sort of the political cultural explanations, political identity, he actually writes in the introduction of the book that, quote, helped by the collapse of Marxism as an analytical tool, all-embracing project, and by the demise of theories of dependency, economic explanations of contemporary social and political phenomena have, with consideration of the draconian character of external constraints, all but disappeared. All struggles have become struggles of representation. Levies, exploitation, corrivy, taxes, tribute, and coercion no longer exist. Everything has become network, and no one asks anymore about the market and capitalism as institutions both contingent and violent. I thought it was interesting that even Achille Mbembe in the introduction to his book, which is very much kind of associated with a sort of critique of Marxism view on school, acknowledges that in the introduction.
Yeah, and I think this relates to the question I want to ask, which is, Annie, you were saying that you're trying to think through these essentialist understandings of social categories that are starting to become embedded in identity politics and in sort of progressive politics. And, I'm starting to notice it sometimes, occasionally, on the radical left as well. So, I might get canceled for saying this, but sometimes I often get a little bit uncomfortable, reading Cedric Robinson's work. And we did a show about him very recently, which was extremely illuminating. But I suppose what I struggle to grapple with is how Robinson, presents the Black radical tradition in opposition to Marxism. And, presents the Black radical tradition almost as an alternative to Marxist politics, and refers to a group of intellectuals that I would ordinarily associate with Marxism. So I suppose the question I want to ask is, what do you think produces this kind of interest in trying to present a radical politics, but one that is detached from Marx? So I guess really it's just a question of Cedric Robinson and how you receive him in relation to the conversation that we've been having. But how do we make sense of this sort of development?
Yeah, I'm one of the people that I want to kind of focus on eventually in my project. So I'm going to reserve some comment, some of the comments. I would say that I am increasingly thinking of 1983 as a transition year, and that's the year that Black Marxism came out. And it's also incidentally the year that the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies released a book called Empire Strikes Back, and these are strikingly oppositional accounts of what trends are developing and also how we ought to conceive of our political communities. And I read Robinson and ask two questions. Firstly, in terms of the stakes of proving a racialism that exists in Europe prior to capitalism and prior to colonization. If, for instance, that requires us hollowing out the concept of racialism to such an extent that it's just as easily applicable to the cultural differences that exist on the continent prior to colonization. In that sense, racialism isn't a unique export of Europe to the rest of the world. The second problem I have is a reading of, and this is oftentimes things that people ascribe to Robinson after the text. I mean, a lot of people kind of go to Black Marxism thinking it's going to be some kind of Bible of Black Marxism. But so many of the people who are ascribed as part of the Black radical tradition in opposition to Marxism derive their radical politics and develop their radical politics through dialogue with and organization with radical movements which aren't categorized as Black within this framework, right? And so what does it mean to extricate this particular dynamic of racialization as Black as being the sole determining factor? Now, I don't think Robinson is making the argument as crudely as that, but I would kind of suggest that if we're to kind of, I don't know, I think for me, the more helpful framing is theorizing Black as a subject position. And that subject position doesn't have to map onto a material reality. I think most of the problems we have come from theorizing this position of the Black in the abstract and then trying to map that really neatly onto, when we know that it's sort of produced by all of these different processes, map that then onto the category of the sub-Saharan African or the person of sub-Saharan African descent, and that's really messy. Sorry, I hope that made sense. I kind of went around a bit in rambling.
Yeah, I mean, if I can say, something also on Black Marxism. I mean, I think maybe it has something to do more with the reception of the text than maybe Robinson's intention, but maybe it's sort of, lended itself to that reading. But I think one criticism that we can make also of Robinson is that, when you read the text, one thing I found surprising is the extent to which the concept of Western civilization plays an important analytic role, right? Because part of the argument is that Marxism emerged from this civilization, and he doesn't really, define for us what Western civilization means, but I would say that precisely where a kind of historical materialist analysis would fit in is to sort of question the analytic adequacy of a concept like Western civilization or Western culture or something like that, because it always forces you, obviously, you do have, the kind of relative autonomy of cultural spheres and all of that, but you still have to tie to specific modes of production, and that allows you to also note discontinuities, because this idea of Western civilization, it's also a kind of very 19th century development. It's a created image positing discontinuity. I mean, somebody like Aristotle wouldn't think of himself as Western, if he was alive, but yet he gets assimilated into that discourse, of course.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thread to continue on from both of you. When we think of how Western civilization can end up being reified as a continuous category that is fixed and doesn't change as social reality changes. How do we sort of position the relationship between Marxism and sort of the rise of post-colonial studies? We were talking about Zeyad earlier, and Zeyad is often attributed as being the founder of this, and he himself denied that. So this mode of critique that sort of whose object is practically Western civilization and how the world is constructed in its image. So I mean, there's this always uneasy relationship between the two bodies of thought, and can the differences between the two of them be reconciled, or are they irreconcilable? I think these debates, especially nowadays, feel like they're reaching a fever pitch.
You can go first.
I'm trying to get both of you cancelled after this by asking you.
Yeah, we're sorry. We're sorry.
No, it's fine. I don't want to say anything. I don't want to say anything glib. I would say I remember watching years and years ago, and I can't remember who it is, but it was a post-colonial theorist, and they were speaking in the introduction to a talk about this letter that Engels wrote to the editor of a newspaper on the relative kind of the question of the role of politics versus the role of like the economic question. And it was really interesting because what that opened up for me is like a rethinking. I think part of what the academy does today is like reify the strict opposition between categories of thinking, right? And if we step back and say, okay, well, like what are the tools that are being offered by this frame of thinking? What are the tools that are being offered by Marxism? What are the tools that are being offered by post-colonial theory? Sometimes they are in opposition. What we can then see is the really interesting ways in which people are engaging with each other. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. But all of that is to say that I have my own feelings about how like the notion of the post-colonial reorients our thinking to believing that we live in a post-colonial world, which we obviously don't. We face active settler colonial projects, not least in Palestine, but also just kind of thinking about what role that played. And actually, I can't remember the text, but it's a David Scott text, which talks about how the moment of the post-colonial is also the moment of the notion of a global revolution being receded into the notion of the nation, and the nation building project suddenly taking primacy over the project of global transformation. And I think that that really speaks well to how a lot of movements on the African continent in the mid to late 20th century get read today as nationalist movements, which sought to build particular types of state. And then the primary question becomes how that state is able to leverage power vis-a-vis the West, rather than the question of how the people who were engaged in that project on a mass scale were seeking to bring about a world in which, well, the nation state form itself became irrelevant, and the community or the associations of people became more important.
Zeyad, do you want to say something to that?
Yeah. I mean, just in relation to the question of sort of post-colonial discourse, I think it's sort of dangerous, I guess, to paint it all with one brush or something. But I think one element I would say that we can criticize it for, and I think it would be legitimate, is that often it takes for granted what the Eurocentric story is, right? So, for example, when you see texts criticizing Marxism, it's often assumed, and they use Marxism without adjectives, so it's not like geographically located or anything, but they're essentially, criticizing, for example, the Frankfurt School. And there is no attention, again, to sort of the global intellectual history of Marxism, which sort of, again, reproduces this narrative that Marxism is sort of like a Western project, even though, the history of Marxism in the second half of the 20th century is very much the history of, what they call today the global South, or what they called back then the Third World. Just like, you couldn't possibly write a history of Marxism in the 20th century without taking that into account. To just not.
Which is a good time, I think, to ask you about, because before we got on the program, we were just chatting, and one of the things you mentioned is that your research includes work of this kind of theorizing that happened on the African continent. I sort of mentioned this in passing earlier. And a lot of it was taking place in Tanzania, right, in Dar es Salaam. Do you want to just say, given what you just said about the history of Marxism in the 20th century is kind of in the global South? Can you just say a little bit about that?
Right. So one of the things I look at is the debate between proponents of African socialism in Tanzania under Nyerere, and African Marxists who sort of took an oppositional stance. I mean, it was a complex stance, not wholly oppositional to African socialism. But for example, in some of Nyerere's speeches, and Nyerere's thought is quite complex and develops over time. But in some of his speeches, he would speak of a traditional African society which was classless. Therefore, a theory that emphasizes class struggle as sort of like the vehicle for historical transformation is not relevant to that society. And you had people like Dan Nabuderi, who was from Uganda, Ugandan lawyer, political economist, and also like later on sort of more of a cultural theorist later in his life. And you had people like Abdurrahman Muhammad Babu from Zanzibar, who took sort of a critical stance towards this, and they tried to show, well, actually, this is sort of not really historically true. You had basically things that we can refer to as sort of tributary societies in some of those social formations that they were discussing. But more importantly, because this is where I think this sort of debate is relevant today, they ended up trying to understand, okay, how does this discourse of African socialism emerge? It emerges in Tanzania, it emerges in Senegal, Senghor as well. It also emerges, something similar emerges in North Africa, which was more like Arab socialism in Egypt, for example. And they try to analyze it as a kind of what they call a petty bourgeois discourse that seeks to sort of obfuscate internal class struggles and subsumes them in the name of a kind of national struggle. And obviously the relationship between sort of internal class struggles and the periphery, if you want to call it, or the neo-colonies as they were called in those debates, and a kind of national liberation project is complex. And I think similar debates would be fruitful today. This is why I think this stuff is relevant, and this is why I bring it up. So I don't want to speak too long, so I'll stop here, see if you have any follow-up questions.
I suppose my follow-up is, what is it meant for Marxism generally to have lost those thinkers? I mean, so there's a generation of thinkers which are operating around the mid-20th century period. They're in Dar es Salaam and they're debating. And then there's another generation that follows on from that includes, figures like Samir Amin, who also wrote on tributary modes of production, world systems theory, and so on. And that generation is slowly starting to disappear. Unfortunately, most of them are aging and they're passing away. And it seems like we've reached a kind of a vacuum in an intellectual vacuum that is sort of unable to kind of to give us the tools that we need to continue thinking critically about the historical moment. So what do you think the loss of these African Marxists, as our viewers in the comments have wonderfully been reminding us, existed in abundance? What is it meant to have lost them, not only tragically when they pass away, but a lot of them also kind of, as happened in South Africa, migrating into government, overseeing a neoliberal program in after independence. What has that meant for Marxism?
Yes, so I mean, it's definitely. I think the biggest problem is we haven't had, like you said, maybe the chains of transmission have been broken, and I think this is one of the biggest issues. And I think this is why it's very important to sort of bring attention to these texts, the way sort of we're doing today, and maybe there's a possibility we can like post a bibliography or something. I think that would be because also the texts are mostly out of print, very difficult to find. So if you find them, it's sort of by chance, really. But I think one important thing is for us to at least go back and study these things. And we're not saying okay, people must be Marxists and sort of like dive into these debates, but at least know what you're rejecting. If you're saying, okay, well, Marxism is this Eurocentric thing, at least sort of like look at the history of Marxism in these places and these debates. So at least you have, some kind of understanding of the thing you're rebelling against. And I think that's I think what we should at least try to do. And not just because it's often, it's very interesting that a lot of the characterizations of Marx as Eurocentric, they also come from universities in the West, which is interesting. I mean, that like from the standpoint of the sociology of knowledge is an interesting phenomenon, but, we can go into that later, I guess.
That's absolutely true. I was going to add just one more thing, and it was really interesting when you were kind of talking about Marx's position of not simply kind of refuting the notion of this classless society that exists prior to colonization, this like weird thing that we have to in some way resurrect. It's a strangely conservative logic, but also asking the question of why this is coming to prominence at this particular juncture. And so I am of the opinion, in a very bold claim I'm about to make, that we have to kind of turn it away from the external forces which are affecting us and the kind of broader structure, but also the people who are attacking the left and Marxists. There's a sustained attack on the tradition of Black Marxism. But to think more inwardly or be more reflective, I would say that we have not done such a great job at narrating our defeat and having that story of what precisely has changed. If as Marxists we say that like the social world produces the way that we conceive of the social world, and then in turn we kind of act on that world to make history, then that big first question is really important for us to answer. And I think that all too often our stories become about these heroes who we tragically lost. We seek out individuals who, like, if only we went back and fought a bit harder using this program, if only we like didn't lose this person at this moment, as opposed to the kind of collective mass political histories that are required to be able to understand, well, why was it in the 1970s that like Marxism was the winning position? Why did it feel like people were on the eve of revolution? And why did that change? I don't think the assassination of one Black Marxist can change the hearts and minds of millions of people across the global South, right? And so something deeper has to be happening. I think that's the thing we have to contend with.
I was muted there because I wanted to ask like a sort of, which I think is in a way sort of the final question, but it's in a way also kind of a follow-up. There is an element in the room, right, which is the role of popular culture and what people describe as kind of the domination or in political debates about the African world, if there is such a thing, the United States and the debates within the US become really decisive in determining how people talk about politics. And I would even suggest like how, well, social movements develop organically, but there's a way in which these social movements, I think, are often in conversation with and gets influenced heavily by the terminology, by thinking about what is politically possible, or even in terms of like what are we building on? I think a lot of it draws on the influence of the American world. So can you say a little bit about that? Because I think we speak in here a lot about what's happening in the university, but we recognize, of course, that, and I think Ani was mentioning, Fees Must Fall, right? Or End SARS, or Tahrir Square, or what happened in Tunisia. Like, there are real political movements that are happening on the continent, and as I'm trying to suggest, Black Lives Matter is if you look in the last summer, it is probably the most decisive political movement globally. If you think of people of African descent, or if you want the African world, like how can you get at that? Like, how would you respond to that kind of problematic?
I think that it's not new to kind of think of the struggles that are happening in the imperial core, specifically of African Americans, as a vanguard struggle. That's not new. I think what is new is the requirement that the movements that are happening across the global periphery are legible within the frameworks offered by North America. Well, that's my little one getting him. And so I think there's a way we do this false internationalism of assuming if we talk about Black Lives Matter, if we talk about what's happening in the imperial core, then we are being internationalists. But, the level of political education that we were looking at in the 60s and 70s wasn't simply about knowing our own context. Black Panthers could tell you about the struggles that were happening in Congo, could tell you about the struggle of the Mozambican people, could tell you about the struggle of the Angolan people, right? Today, we don't have that. Today, we only get glimpses through social media of what resistance there is left on the continent, right? And that's awful. I don't know how we confront that, because that's such a huge challenge, right? And so I don't want to speak for too long, but I definitely think that part of the frame is, one, we haven't fully accounted for, if we're talking about into like a world system which is structured in a particular way, then the political economy of the US Academy has to have a role to play in terms of like our ability to understand why these frames get exported to the continent. The political economy of like Black culture, in which centers and focuses on the Black American context, has to be taken into account. And none of these things are a moral critique. None of these things are by the design of African American scholars or African American activists or organizers. These are broader social forces which are being brought to bear on what is intelligible to us and what isn't. I'll leave it there.
I mean, I'm definitely in agreement with Annie here. I think this sort of influence, especially the way certain things become, a kind of aesthetic motif, and it gets, transferred that way. I think that can be a problem, but I think it's not really a massive problem if we actually have organizations on the ground. It becomes a massive problem when, all that exists is Twitter discourse. Then it's a problem. Then you have to really, worry, and you sort of inflate something that shouldn't really become a problem, and you have this sort of reaction against it. But I think we can't really forget the importance of building on-the-ground organizations, because again, to go back to the points we're making about, transmission of skills, transmission of memory, this is where this stuff happens. And I think, people think of this as sort of like an old-fashioned party approach, but it's really, I still think it's very much relevant as a repository of sort of social knowledge and historical understanding. I think we really need these forms. So I'll just stop there. I don't think I have more to add on that.
I think, yeah, thank you to both of you. That was brilliant. I think this is a good time to conclude the show. For my part, it just seems like, this work that we're describing for ourselves that still needs to come of understanding exactly the nature of the social forces we're reckoning with, how our social world is produced and how that in turn produces us. It just always feels like, at some point we need to have the serious debate about whether or not the left needs to log off, because truly, social media just feels like such a toxic and distracting thing. And of course, now I'm individualizing the problem and expecting that there's going to be this mass exit that one can coordinate. But I do think that, this return to the ground, the return to the roots, the ignoring of all of the noise
if it doesn't happen on Twitter, then it didn't happen.
It didn't happen, exactly. And we need to know that. We need to know. I mean, that seems to be the framework we operate under. But I mean, this is just to say, I think you're all absolutely right in the sense that we just need to, ignore the noise and get on with the work we know that we need to do. So to get on with that work, let's end the show and get right to it. But more importantly, to say thank you to both of you, Annie and Zeyad, and thank you to Sean, my co-host, as well as our producer, Antoinette Engel, who's in Cape Town. I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation. There's been a lot of conversation between us in the chat. So yeah, keep a lookout for what comes from this, especially on the issues of knowledge and archives and all of these resources that we would like to access. So on that note, thank you to our viewers as always, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.
And I think we should